basically felt like an eternity is now reality now. Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake is finally here, and it's definitely been quite a wait for this game to come out. Announced back in 2021 during the 35th anniversary stream of Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake was definitely one of the games that most people were talking about in regards to announcements made during that time. And unfortunately for us, we had to wait quite a while for this release to come out, or get any kind of information, seeing how in 2022, there was no information, 2023, no information as well, and only focusing on releases like Dragon Quest Treasures, Infinity Strash, and Dragon Quest Monsters. The only thing we would really get during those times was interviews with Yuji Horii saying, "We're still working on it, expect something soon." And soon never really came until 2024 during Dragon Quest Day, where they finally teased the game for once. And then we got the proper announcement during the Nintendo Direct. And for me, it was definitely a long time coming, finally seeing this game become reality, and coming out in November of all times. This was definitely a time for me to get excited, as the wait was finally over. Though of course there was some unfortunate things that happened here and there, whether it was due to the censorship made to the game, or changing gender terms to Type A, Type B sort of ordeal. For me regardless, it didn't really bother me, because I waited for this game almost for forever, and I wanted to play this game desperately in a way. And the question is ultimately, after waiting for so long, was the wait worth it? Well, that's exactly what we're going to find out today. So, let's dive right in. Starting with the story, not much was really changed, but of course I do feel the need to give you guys a little bit of a summarization of the story. This local town hero known as Ortega goes on this journey to defeat the evil Archfiend, but disappears when he goes up to the mountain of Mount Necrogard. And on your 16th birthday, you, the hero, go in to fill in his shoes and go out on this journey. It's a pretty simplistic plot that essentially drives you to go out on this journey and defeat the evil Archfiend. And one of the things that the developers said about this game was they were going to expand on the story, when in reality, the expansion really is just telling you where to go next. Additional cutscenes are really just there to tell you, hey, you need to go to this location to get the magic key, or there's these orbs you need to go on and collect. It doesn't really do much to expand on the story or the lore of Dragon Quest III, more so to tell you where to go next. And I personally don't really have too much of an issue with that addition right there, because of course for most people, not that many people are used to having that much freedom and non-linearity. But for me personally, I'm kind of disappointed that the enhancements are really just telling you where to go next. Not to say those are the enhancements made, as there are backstories regarding Ortega when you go to particular locations like the village of Myrrh, and there are indeed some cutscenes that do enhance the story, though by a little bit. But for the most part, these cutscenes are really meant to serve to tell you where exactly to go next, and yeah, it's a little bit disappointing. And there are some changes here and there in regards to the plot as well. One of them, for example, is in the village of Myrrh. Originally in the past releases, the villagers of Myrrh eventually find out you're indeed the child of Ortega. But in the HD 2D release, instead they find out that you're originally from the same town that Ortega is from, and they do give you his helmet because they do believe you'll eventually find him. Never once do they find out you're his child. And I thought this change was unnecessary, but at the same time, interesting I guess. So ultimately, I kind of feel they didn't really make much liberal changes to the story or liberal enhancements to the story, but more so service level changes and enhancements. It doesn't really go far enough in my opinion to fully enhance it or make it a big deal that you're going out your way and making these major changes. The one thing I will say is the one thing that does enhance the game's story is the voice acting. As for the first time ever for Dragon Quest III, there is indeed voice acting for the game in both English and Japanese. I played through the whole game in Japanese, and the Japanese voice acting does a great job at giving depth and emotion to these particular scenes that we're used to in Dragon Quest III. I heard little snippets of the English voice acting, and I do think they do a great job as well. Though enhancements to the story being flimsy aside, what was a major enhancement of course is the graphics. As the name implies, this is indeed using the HD 2D art style that Square Enix has been touting since Octopath Traveler. And it does indeed look gorgeous on Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake. The sprite work from the NPCs and your main characters look great, the monsters look great, and the environments all look great as well. Though the one thing that surprised me is when you compare this to Octopath Traveler, Live Alive, or Octopath Traveler 2, you might notice some major differences here and there. For example, some of the buildings in Octopath, Live Alive, or Octopath 2, or some of the pavements kind of have this pixelated look, but in Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake, all the environments are fully 3D. They're all full 3D environments. In many cases, it almost feels similar to the Star Ocean remake that came out last year, where all the environments were fully 3D, while the main characters and the such were all pixel art. Though at the same time, I would say Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake is more closer to Octopath and Live Alive, despite not having pixelated buildings or pavements. Though despite that main difference, it still looks great nonetheless. And of course, the music is fantastic as well. For the first time for Dragon Quest III, officially, we now have orchestrated music done by the Tokyo Metropolitan Symphony. And it sounds fantastic here in Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake. Adventure sounds bombastic, the town themes, the village themes all sound peaceful, the cave and tower themes bring in the sense of mystery. Everything just sounds beautiful in Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake. Though of course, seeing how some songs didn't have orchestrated versions, those use the same MIDIs that we're used to, though regardless, it creates a perfect package when it comes down to presentation. Though of course the presentation is only a part of the story. Of course, we need to talk about the gameplay and the progression. And seeing how I already talked about those things in my Dragon Quest III review, I'm only going to focus on the differences here and the additions made to Dragon Quest III HD-2D. Starting of course with your party members, you can now change the appearances and add in voices for your party members. You have 4 options to choose from depending on the classes you choose or gender, and you can choose whatever voice you want as well. And of course for me, who's a sucker for customization, this is indeed a good addition to Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake. I can now alter the looks of the characters and tailor make them to how I want them to be. The one thing I would say is the voices don't sound all too different to me. At least the female voices, because I went with an all-female team for my adventure, but I can hardly tell. And of course, the other thing when it comes down to your party members is a brand new class known as the Monster Wrangler. And I have to say, they're pretty decent until the later game. What do I mean by this? Well, they learn all the abilities that monsters learn throughout the game. They definitely know a lot of the abilities. But then once you get to the later levels with the Monster Wrangler, their stats kind of start teetering off a bit. They start becoming a little bit more weaker, lower in stats in comparison to your other party members. And I definitely noticed this when I got to the Dark World, where the Monster Wrangler wasn't really keeping up with my hero when it came down to physical stats. So while I say they were a good addition, they definitely do have a huge downside, which is that later half when they start progressing in levels. And speaking of spells and abilities, we have brand new spells and abilities in this game. For example, we now have More Heal, we have Zen, we have Metal Slash, we have Flame Slash, we have Giga Slash. The list goes on and on with all the brand new abilities you have. And I have to say, with the new spells and abilities and the fact that the All Trades Ally still works as it does, to where you have to at least reach level 20, and when you change to a new class you go back to level 1, all your stats are half, but you keep all your spells and abilities. It gives you more reasons to go to the All Trades Ally, learn these new abilities for your characters, and essentially suit them up to be these super characters in a sense. For example, once I knew my Monster Wrangler learned all his abilities, I switched it over to a warrior, learned all those abilities for a warrior, and I switched it over to a martial artist, maxed out all the abilities, and learned critical claim, which made it easier for me to take down liquid metal slimes and metal slimes in general. And I switched it back to a warrior because, in terms of leveling growth, the warrior just leveled up much quicker in comparison to the martial artist. And I essentially had a beefcake when it came down to physical abilities. You can now tailor make these characters to be super characters in a sense. And that's something I do like about this HD-2D remake. You can now do almost anything you want with these characters. And I can go on and on about how much more in depth they made the characters and the classes and the All Trades Ally. But there's still more things that they did to enhance the experience of Dragon Quest III HD-2D. There's now the Monster Arena, where you find stray monsters across the field and then use them to help you fight in the Monster Arena. Gone are the days where we just gambled to see who will win, to now a system that's more similar to Dragon Quest VIII or the Dragon Quest Monster games. There's now these secret spots in the overworld where you can find stray monsters or mini medals or just chests laying around. And there's now sparkly spots all over the overworld that gives you extra items. And even traversing the world is much more streamlined. You can now zoom to almost anywhere you want, whether it's every single town, shrines, or hell, even dungeons. You can just simply zoom there. And definitely made things a lot more easier. For example, the Love Locket quest, where you go to the pirate ship and get the Love Locket, you can simply just zoom to the shrine that's close by to it, and there you go. Though it does come at a cost when it comes down to the streamlining. Like I mentioned in the story synopsis, The story enhancements are really just there to tell you exactly where to go next. And yeah, every single time you beat a boss or progress through the story, they just tell you exactly where to go next. And hell, there's now exclamation points to tell you this is exactly where you need to go. And it definitely ruins a bit of that exploration and discovery when they just give you a little bit of an exclamation point. And even though you can turn off some things like the minimap and the objective locator, some of the things like the exclamation points, you can't turn off. And I definitely felt how handholdy this version of the game is. Though that's not to say the non-linearity of the game is gone, because it's still there, but they definitely do bonk you on the head of where to go next. And that's a little bit of a shame there, and especially on Draconian mode, which is the difficulty I played on, I kind of wish they got rid of some of those things to tell you where to go next, if you played in Draconian mode at the very least. And yes, there's multiple difficulties in this game from Drakey mode, Dragon Quest mode, and Draconian. And despite that, the only one I can say is the ultra easy mode is Drakey mode, because even on Dragon Quest mode, I'm going to tell you, this is a much more difficult experience in comparison to the NES, the Super Famicom, the Game Boy, or the mobile releases. Because like I mentioned about the fact there's now new spells and abilities, the same thing applies to the monsters. They know those spells and abilities as well. And when you deal with boss battles, you definitely do feel it, as brand new boss battles were added into this remake. For example, the Pyramids in Ibis, there's now a boss you need to deal with before getting the magic key. And I had a bit of a time dealing with that guy. And in the Cursed Village of Thedon, there's now some dying breaths you have to deal with, and they were also annoying as hell. And of course, when you go out and throw the Mountain Cleaver in Mount Necroguard, there's now the Gargoyle fight you need to deal with. Though the one thing I realized was, if I added in certain accessories on, it would have made those experiences much more easier. And yes, much like before, there's now new items and accessories you can get in Dragon Quest III HD-2D from Magic Waters, Elfin Elixirs, and a bunch of accessories. Especially ones that deal with limiting the elements from certain elements, like fire, ice, or wind. And it really did remind me a bit of the Trails games, because those games have a bunch of accessories that deal less in status ailments. Doing that same thing here in Dragon Quest III HD-2D definitely did remind me of the Trails games. And that's something to get used to, because in Dragon Quest particularly, I never really bothered too much about accessories and what kind of accessories I want on my party members. I just throw them onto my party members and go on with my day. But in this remake here, I have to worry more about which accessories I need to put on when dealing with boss fights, because sometimes they have wind powers or fire powers or ice powers. And it's definitely a different experience this time around. Though aside from those changes, the level design is mostly the same. Some small redesigns were made here and there, and some brand new areas were made for this remake. And for the most part, the experience in Dragon Quest III HD-2D felt right at home despite these changes here. Though of course it does suck that the TNT boards from the SNES and the Game Boy version are not here in this remake, though we get mini-melts at the very least. And those are the things I wanted to highlight in regards to the gameplay changes and the progression in Dragon Quest III HD-2D. And now we're going to move on to spoilers, and of course if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this portion right here. So after you beat Barrowmills and you celebrate the day and Zoma pops up, another story change is made to where your parents are now watching you as you celebrate the defeat of Barrowmills and Zoma pops out of nowhere. And you get a little bit of a cutscene between you and your mother. And in the past releases, at any time you can go over to the castle of the Dragon Queen and get the Sphere of Light, but in the HD-2D remake they do force you to go on and get the Sphere of Light first before heading down to the Dark World. And the Dark World is mostly much the same, though there is of course some extra boss fights when it comes down to climbing up to the Tower of Rubis. And of course when you get the Sword of Kings, you need to get some extra things in order to make the Sword of Kings, like this broken sword in Cat Lin, the hammer in Junpang, and of course the Auriculum as we're used to. And of course, when we go to Zoma's castle, the same scene where Ortega dies to Zoma's henchman is there, and it's definitely much more heartfelt thanks to the voice acting. And we do deal with the same three bosses before facing off with Zoma, and they're definitely much harder this time around, especially the Soul of Barrowmills. Man, that was a bitch to deal with. And Zoma initially was pretty hard because of this ice breath being very hard hitting, but thanks to putting on accessories, the boss fight becomes much more easier, which is quite hilarious. And when you beat the game and the celebrations go on, you get some cutscenes showing what everyone did, including the hero, essentially teasing into Dragon Quest I, and you get a post-game cutscene where the egg that the Dragon Queen leaves behind is taken care of by the priest Hargon. And for anyone who played Dragon Quest II, yeah, you know what's going to happen from here. And for me, I was kind of blown away saying, holy f***, this guy right here is Hargon. This guy right here who claimed to be the Dragon Queen's right-hand man is actually this guy who wants chaos at the end of it. That's insane. And of course we have the post-game, to which we have the same bonus dungeon from the SNES version, where we challenged this dragon known as Shenlong. And to my surprise, Shenlong wasn't too hard, probably just because I grinded a bunch, and this was really when I went out and took advantage of the Eltree's Owl by maxing out my characters, and then switching them to a different class, and reverting them back to the class I wanted them to be. It definitely made the Shenlong boss fight a lot easier. And you do get some new wishes here, like changing the appearance of the hero, which really just means changing the hair color, doing more of the monster arena, and having a brand new dungeon. Yes, you heard me right. And this is not the Ice Cave for anyone who played the Game Boy version. This is known as the Temple of Trials, a brand new dungeon for Dragon Quest III HD-2D. And you have 5 trials to go through, 2 of them being dungeon based, but you have to have specific equipment on, and the other 3 being essentially fed quests. One of them is getting 100 monsters, the other is getting all the legendary equipment, and the other one is breaking your goddamn wallet. And I seriously do mean that. One of the things this guy requests is 25 elfin elixirs, and they're 40,000 gold. And essentially you're going out and breaking your wallet. But once you do all these trials, you have the chance to go up against the Grand Dragon. And it's definitely the toughest boss fight out of the bunch. And you do need to beat him under a certain amount of turns, which I haven't done so far just yet. But at least I beat him, so there you go. And that's basically everything in the post-game. In the similar sets to the Super Famicom version, it's basically much the same, with some extra things with the Temple of Trials. And when you do one of the wishes, which is revive Ortega, you do get a nice little cutscene with him. But I think it's time for me to give my final thoughts. As I mentioned before, I waited quite a while for this release to come out since 2021, and every time 2022 came around and 2023 and nothing happened, I was left disappointed. And when this game finally was unveiled this year, I was ready for this release. And when finally playing it, I have to say, the wait was quite worth it, but as someone who does look at things critically, there are some issues of course. Like I said, the story enhancements are barely much enhancements, they're really just there to tell you where to go next, and the enhancements that are there don't really add much to Dragon Quest III as a whole. I thought they were really going to dig deep into Dragon Quest III's story and the lore. And I'm not too much of a fan of how hand-holdy this remake is, constantly telling you where to go next, constantly bonking in your head, this is where you need to go. But aside from that, I was a huge fan of the class system, the fact you can constantly change them and max out your characters and make these super characters in a sense. Obviously it takes a lot of time and a lot of grinding, but it's still cool nonetheless. You're indeed rewarded. And the brand new boss fights were indeed challenging, some of them a bit annoying at times, but once you start knowing the strategies and knowing the fact you need to put on accessories, they do indeed become fun boss fights. And overall, this is still Dragon Quest III as I know it. Still has the same layout, still has the same progression, just some extra things added into this release. So would I say this is the definitive version of Dragon Quest III? Well, the answer is no, seeing how we don't have the TNT boards, and we don't have the additions made to the Game Boy release, like the Ice Cave and the such. But I will say, this is indeed a great version of Dragon Quest III. The additions made to this game are great. But at the same time, I would be lying if I told you that I would sometimes like to replay the SNES version, because that's more of the aesthetic Dragon Quest III experience. As HD2D is indeed a different experience in some cases because of the additions made to this remake, to which is reason for me to go back to the SNES release. But that's not to say Dragon Quest III is a bad remake. It's an amazing remake, and something I would recommend to people if they've never played this legendary game before. To which for me, of course, I'm left satisfied. See you guys on the next one. Take care.